I this. And for some reason, and I don't know why, but a lot of people are asking me, where did Microsoft, well, not ask me, or trying to explain to me, where did Microsoft go wrong with their hardware? And of course, they all randomly pick the RAM. That's not true. In fact, it's nowhere near true. The RAM isn't the problem on the Xbox One. In fact, Microsoft shouldn't have even put in that ES RAM because that was even more stupider. Because pretty much that extra ES RAM wasn't needed. In fact, most video games nowadays really only take up 164 megabytes of RAM, and for one reason and one reason only. And that is because, they're still going by, they just don't really take as much RAM as you think they do, even with all the great graphical powers that they have. Yes, some RAMs take up to 1 gig or a few gigs, but this was always needed. In fact, if you wanted to future-proof, all you needed was at least 4 gigs of RAM. In most computers, the reason why computers need 8 gigs of RAM is because they're running a desktop. And, of course, word processings, video memories, and of course, web browsers, which is all being run at once. Consoles don't need this. They don't do all that. They just need to run the game and have a few background things happening. That's it. That's all that it needs. So when Sony put in GDDR5 RAM, it was a lot. But oddly enough, it was also somewhat of a good idea. I mean, chances are that the PS4 would have failed, but it didn't. But, well, it didn't fail. So it paid off. And I have to say Sony got lucky. But of course, Sony also got smart and wised up after the complete clusterfuck known as the PlayStation 3. And the significant amount of RAM problems, especially when they were using that bizarre XDR RAM, which, yeah, it's still a mess over at Sony on PlayStation 3. So the RAM just wasn't the problem. The problem is that Microsoft made a very severe and very stupid mistake with the ES RAM. And by the way, the ES RAM itself isn't the fucking problem. In the 34 megabytes of RAM, it did kind of make it as faster as the GDDR5 RAM, but it didn't help. The mistake was how they did it and what they ended up doing. You see, Xbox One and PlayStation 4 are on an APU, which, the CPU and the GPU are all on this single plate die thing. But, and of course, Sony was smart. Even though they used a smaller CPU die for their APU and a very huge GPU die on their APU, Microsoft, for some bizarre reason that doesn't make any sense, the CPU die made sense because they made it very huge. But the GPU die, they shrunk it down at the last minute. And this is where the ES RAM comes in. Because on that APU, they put the ES RAM on that die, taking the place of the GPU die. Or at least where the GPU die was before they shrunk it down. Or at least in the parts where it used to be. Now, the GPU ended up taking even lesser real estate, causing the GPU and the graphics within the Xbox One to be less powerful. Now, all these people seem to magically think that the CPU is going to save it, or that now they got rid of the Kinect, this thing's going to be as magically and even more powerful than the PlayStation 4. No, it's not. That's impossible. The die size on the GPU is too small. Way too fucking small. There isn't enough graphical power in the GPU size. There just isn't enough room in the GPU size die of the Xbox One to produce, spectacular effects in the level of the PlayStation 4, because Sony realized that they needed to save most of that die space for the GPU space and just put in a small CPU. And the reason why Sony wasn't worried about the CPU size die and the power was because of a simple programming language called the GPU, which puts all the graphical powers on the GPU die, which means that the CPU doesn't have to do that much. It just takes a lot of the work off the CPU and then sticks it mostly right there on the GPU. In fact, Nintendo was the first. The Wii U was the first console to do this with the whole GPU, which is why. Well, of course, the Wii U is not on the APU thing. It just has a PowerPC processor and a GPU processor, and of course, their GPU is not all that strong. But of course, the Wii U is weaker than the Xbox One and the PS4. But there you go. It's just that Nintendo didn't have to worry about their CPU because they used the GPU technology to just stick all the graphic powers right on the GPU instead of having it trade between both the CPU and the GPU. But in layman's terms, or to simplify it, Microsoft cut out pieces of the GPU to make room for the ESRAM that is in the Xbox One. The ESRAM's not interfering with shit, or at least it is in size, since it took up most of the space that the GPU would have had. I'm hoping that this video will at least teach a lot of you people what Microsoft really did, what was wrong. Not come up with this bizarre thing about the RAM using texture flowings and all this other crap, which, has nothing to even do with any of that. No, Microsoft took their graphics processor, shrunk it down, and put in ESRAM. So they could fit in ESRAM because they were listening to the trolls on the internet who was saying that RAM can do graphics. I'm not joking. Just go watch Blackmon's videos. He's been screaming that nonsense for a while. But of course, Sony, they went for the overkill. They went with the GDR5 RAM, which equals to that of close to, I think, the 50 gigs. If you taken that 8 gigs of RAM and converted it over to DDR3 RAM, it would be close to 50 gigs. Seriously, Sony way the fuck overdid it on the RAM. There's just way too much RAM in the PS4. But it's not the PS4's RAM that makes the graphics and resolution so superior. It's just that Sony wised up, and when they developed the APU, they put a lot of space for that GPU. And then with their GPU programming on there, that thing it basically turned the PS4 into a graphical powerhouse. I mean, graphics and resolutions and all this other shit. But Microsoft, they just literally cut out most of the GPU and put in that ESRAM because a bunch of people were saying RAM matters. And I've heard dumb videos. I mean, I've heard people say that RAM was more important than, the graphics card and the CPU, or that the CPU was more important than the GPU. If you're working on a computer, and you're not a, gamer or whatever, and you're just working on a basic computer doing word processing or math and stuff, yeah, the CPU is more important than the GPU. And other bizarre things like the conductors were more important than the CPU and GPU, which is just complete and utter bullshit and makes you want to ram your head into a wall. But RAM is more important than the GPU. Seriously. And yeah, Microsoft fucked up in other areas too, mainly in their controller area, because they have two IR blasters on the top of their controllers, which their IR blaster sensor was the Kinect, but now they've thrown out the Kinect. Those two IR blasters now are completely useless. And of course, you got that $20 headphone set add-on, and of course, not a lot of people are happy with that neither. I mean, most of the controller is fine by me. I mean, I've seen the controller, I've touched it over at the stores and stuff, but those two things on there just doesn't make any sense. Oh, okay, the IR blasters made sense, but the headset adapter, $20? Seriously, Microsoft? You're just fucking your customers over on that one? And of course, they're going to sell the Kinect for the PC at $200 a pop. When at the end, all they did was just take that bizarre connection thing at the end and just cut it off and put a USB 3.0. Because that's what the connector is. It's just a bizarre version of the USB 3.0 connector, but, to make it proprietary so nobody else could use it. But now, they're just going to snip the end of that off and just put a real USB 3.0 connector. Which doesn't warrant, why the fuck are you going to sell this thing at $200 fucking dollars, Microsoft? What the fuck is that? And nobody told me that you need drives. If this was true, that they were selling $100 per drive, our printers would be twice the amount of money. Okay, yeah, they came with CDs and stuff, but most printers nowadays don't even come with CDs anymore. Because you can get that shit off of this thing called the internet for free. Hell, I can get any printer from my Mac drivers for free now. All I have to do is just look for the right drivers. It's mainly the hardware you buy. The hardware. Not the software, the hardware. And I still can't find a justifiable excuse for the Kinect at being at $200 for a PC. And a Mac, possibly. It just doesn't make any goddamn lick of sense. It befuddles me on why Microsoft is doing that. But when it comes to the controllers, I do believe that they're going to have, I don't know at what point, probably later on down the lifespan when they realize that the headphone set adapter is not working, and of course the IR blaster is now useless. And by the way, I know I'm probably wrong with the IR blaster, but it's morning and I'm tired. But we will probably see a refinished version of the Xbox One's controller with that will just have a headphone jack at the bottom, no adapter required, and the two IR blasters just gone. Isn't it? And I bet you 1,000,000 to 1 we'll even see possibly next year. Possibly an Xbox One with its DVR features removed. No HDMI in port, just HDMI out. Of course, the Xbox Ones that sell with the DVR functions still working on them, even the connectless ones, will have lesser graphics than the ones that have, the DVR functionalities removed. I'm not joking, because I told you, most of the CPU is being taken up by that DVR functions, and when they remove that DVR functions in a possibly later model, those later models will have more graphical powers than the earlier models, and people will then say, what the fuck? But at least I know why, because I actually understand how these things work. See ya.